Good morning. Today we're going to talk about lasagna gardening and some of the controversy surrounding lasagna gardening, my take on it, and what has worked for me in the past, and what you might consider doing or not doing, depending on your choice. So lasagna gardening is a process of laying down layers of carbon, compost, other sorts of things on the ground, as well as a weed barrier underneath, like cardboard or newspaper, and basically building your garden up by putting it on top of the soil. Rather than tilling the soil, you put layers of this and then you plant right into that. And so there are pros and cons to this approach. I guess we'll start with the cons, and I want to take people's concerns seriously, but at the same time, this is a system that works, and so I think you have to weigh the pros and cons carefully before you make your decision. My decision is that this is a good system, but here are the cons. One issue that people brought up is that the weed barrier, if you use cardboard, say, as a weed barrier, it blocks the soil life from coming up from below. So it will stop the worms, it will serve as a barrier. Earthworms won't be able to get through and could possibly die underneath the weed barrier. This, I think, is valid, and yet I think it's something that you can deal with by poking holes in your weed barrier potentially, and also maybe by leaving some gaps here and there. But you should also realize that worms do have the ability to travel under the ground for a little bit of a distance. And so if you put something, an acre's worth of weed barrier down, well, then that might be a problem for the earthworms. If instead you do more manageable, perhaps like 3 or 4 foot widths, I can't say for certain, but I imagine the earthworms are going to figure out how to get under there and then crawl out and get around and probably right into your garden. At least that appears to be what has happened in the gardens that I've set up like this before. So yeah, valid concern if you're creating a very, very large swath of cardboard, probably less of a problem if you're not. So one of the more creative concerns that I've heard from people is that it stops useful cardboard from going back into the recycling stream. I think this would be a valid concern if this were, say, a large enough percentage of cardboard in the system that was being held back. But quite frankly, there is so much cardboard being recycled right now, and it is a valuable resource. But we're talking about if you do this in your garden and create your nice little raised bed or lasagna garden from using this weed barrier, it's going to be less than 0.00001% of the recycling stream in your town for cardboard. So I don't think that is really a valid argument, but I get it. This is a recyclable resource, and so putting it back into the ground without putting it back in the recycling stream is a bit of a waste. But there is such a thing as too much perfectionism, and sometimes things are just useful, and cardboard is a useful resource as a weed barrier. A valid concern that I have heard is that there can be ink in the cardboard that could be toxic, because not all countries control that very carefully, and cardboard comes from all over the world. So that's certainly a concern, and I would advise using cardboard that doesn't have much ink on it. But that's easy to remedy. That's easy to get around. So I don't think that's something that should be a big drawback for you, but if it is, and you can certainly make a different choice. Finally, I've heard a concern that it can encourage slugs and snails. Now, I don't have any personal experience with this. I don't know why this would encourage slugs and snails more than some other options for creating gardens. I think gardens pretty much all encourage slugs and snails, and if this one creates more of an opportunity, I can't figure out why. The way that I've used materials which seem to keep down slugs and snails is I have used something called salt marsh hay, which is available in my region, and that has a certain amount of salt in it, and it has a texture that appears to dissuade slugs from causing too much havoc in my gardens. I use it as a mulch on top of all sorts of kitchen garden stuff, not for trees, not as much for perennials, although I will say that sometimes if that's what's on hand, I'll toss it down. But in general, I use that in my vegetable gardens. It works really well, and I don't have any problem with slugs. Even though I find slugs around, and I find massive slugs around, they don't seem to cause too much problem for me. Who knows if this is the reason. Also, I'm not entirely averse to eating leaves with a couple of holes chewed out of them, so maybe I'm just not as picky as some people. So anyway, the pros to a lasagna system, and I will tell you exactly how to do this, or how to find out how to do this in a minute, but the pros are that it is super fast. You can lay down a garden fast and be planting in it that afternoon if you move quickly enough, or if you have a few people helping. Another great benefit is that it blocks weeds. So you stop the weeds. You will have to weed eventually, because the weed seeds will get into your garden one way or the other. But this blocks the weeds initially. So instead of tilling up a large area of your lawn where you will immediately get weeds going crazy, this stops that. It also renews soil that is otherwise really maybe not that great for gardening. I have done this on top of compacted soil in a schoolyard where kids were running back and forth every day. We laid down cardboard, and this is my recipe, and it's super easy. Everybody's got their recipe, and some of them are so crazy complex. I've seen recipes with like 7 different types of materials in literally like 11 or 12 different layers. I mean, can you imagine actually going through all of that? And really, honestly, I can't see it being that much better than what the results that I got from mine. So what we used was cardboard, and then we dumped 6 inches of fresh wood chips. And I know there's all kinds of reasons not to put fresh wood chips on your garden, but what we put on top of them was essentially pure composted leaves. So this is composted leaves and it was from the local landfill. It was a schoolyard. They came and dumped this stuff. They dumped fresh wood chips, and then they dumped the compost, which we just spread on top in a 6-inch layer on top. So what are the main arguments about putting fresh wood chips into a garden is that they suck up the nitrogen. My speculation as to why this worked all right to put the compost on top of wood chips, and honestly, this was kind of what you call dumbass luck, because it was what we had, and it was easy and it was fast, and you could do it quickly with kids, and we weren't too concerned if not everything was perfect. So I haven't got to the final layer, which was the salt marsh hay. We just put, a very thick but spread out, fluffed up layer of salt marsh hay. And then we planted actual pre-started plants into that. We had started plants all spring, and we planted those right in. But anyway, my speculation as to why this worked and wasn't too rich for the plants was that that nitrogen sucking effect that I'm talking about, where when you're composting wood chips, and you've got them in a situation where they are exposed to the soil, they can suck up the nitrogen. The decomposers that are taking, and breaking down those wood chips love to suck up nitrogen to do their work. They will eventually release it again, but I think what probably happened was there's so much nutrient in the leaf mulch compost. It's basically the landfill takes all the leaves and composts them, and we can go and buy the compost. Super cheap and really effective compost. So that, my guess is that there was enough nitrogen in that already and enough other nutrients that there was enough for the wood chips to suck in, the nitrogen that they needed, enough for the plants for the first year left over from that process. And then in later years, it has continued to be a very productive garden bed. I have failed at almost nothing that I have tried to plant in those gardens, and quite often we've had so much more food from just, say, one tomato plant in that garden than I've had in other gardens where I thought that I'd done a pretty good job preparing the soil. So this system, albeit potentially flawed in ways that I've already talked about, can be a very productive system, and it's so easy. So I would really encourage you to try this, especially if you have a great resource at your local Department of Public Works, where they are collecting leaves at the end of the season, at the end of the fall, mulching, and then composting those things over the winter, and then providing that compost to people in the spring. Yeah, they've got some weird bits in it, like Christmas tinsel and things like that sometimes, but in general, I pick that up as I go along, and I'm very happy with what we get from that. So you can use that to build up in just a few layers and in just one morning a good-sized garden bed that you will be planting in the next day. Or if you want, if you're using compost that is not from leaves, maybe it's a hotter kind of compost from manure or something like that, you can do this in the fall, and then by the spring, depending on what you're using, you want to do your research, but potentially by the spring you'll be able to grow right in that bed. So anyhow, that is my take on lasagna gardening. I think it's a great method. I think it's a terrific way to get started. You will have you'll have your own experience with it, and you can let me know down below in comments how it goes or how it went. And if you've used one of those more complex layering methods, and if you compared that to a simple method like what I'm talking about, how did that go for you? I'd love to hear. So drop a comment. Please give me the thumbs up. I would love to interact with you more. You can follow me on Instagram, which is @foodforestgardenclub. And you can also find our website, foodforestgardenclub.org, where we have all kinds of cool stuff going on. It is a membership club, so it's only $3 a month, but there is a little bit of a fee to belong, and then you can get in touch with us in person. We have Zoom chats and lots of fun building it at this point, but it is already going great after only a month or so. We've already got some really active members, and looking forward to more meetups in the very near future. So look forward to seeing you. Hope to meet you in person, online, or in some other way. But in the meantime, I hope you have a great day.